Welcome to the Ghost Show online, my fiends, booze, and ghouls. Your hosts, Seika Groves, Rachel Benter, and Ian Russell will discuss all things paranormal. Prepare to be afraid.
So today we're talking about a place called Prospect House Mansion or Prospect Mansion or Kinway. It's got so many different names.
Kinway Mansion.
Kinway, that's it. Kinway Mansion. So we're talking about this. Ian actually mentioned it on the last show that we wanted to touch on this. So this is the house behind me. It's just really cool.
It's so spooky looking.
And I made sure I found like a really neat old black and white photo of it because
is that a widow's peak at the top there?
Yes, it's got that widow's walk.
Yeah.
Widow's
I love
peak.
those.
You know what this house reminds me of, Ian? It reminds me of the
Castle Kilbride.
Kilbride, yep.
Oh,
Castle
yes.
Kilbride in Waterloo area of
Baden.
Ontario, Baden.
Yeah, Baden, Ontario.
It looks a lot like Castle Kilbride. It's really similar.
It does, yeah.
And like Castle Kilbride, everything kind of goes behind it because Castle Kilbride is so
it's narrow.
well, it's narrow, but the weird thing about it is it's got an entire city hall attached to the back of it.
That's right. Yeah.
From the street view, you don't see that until you walk on or pull onto the side of the property, and then you can see that they have City Hall attached to the back of the building, which to me is kind of a shame, but hey, what do I know? I guess it's going to tearing down the house, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the house is kind of a standalone entity, that it's a museum, and then the City Hall is behind it. Now, this one is a museum, as far as I can see from all of the information that I've been looking at, the website. I did quite a bit of digging around to get some information on it. They do have a website, and it's gwacenter.org. So if anybody's interested in visiting this grand palatial home, it's in Ohio near a town called Dresden, Ohio. So sort of the Ohio east part of the state. So Ian, do you want to kick this off? Because you sort of picked this house to talk about, and actually looking at the version of the photograph that I'm looking at now, I can't tell where I'm looking because I'm looking at the house and it looks like you have this house and then there's a structure off the side, but I feel like this is the side of the house. And
well, the house itself, the main house is very squared.
Right. Yes.
So yes, it's going to be difficult to determine in that photograph exactly which side of the house we're looking at.
Right.
And then yes, there's
a
smaller structure that comes off the back, and then beside that there is an old brick barn,
like a stable. Yeah,
that's an old stables and barn structure that's there.
Right. Yes, and I noticed that, and it was really it's really beautiful. I mean, it's a gorgeous home, and it must have been
built in
quite stunning.
1856.
Right. Yeah.
Just beautiful.
So what do you want to tell us about?
Built by a man named George Adams, who was a very successful businessman.
Now, here's something I wondered. Was he related to John Adams, who became...
that I don't know. I don't
That's a
know.
good question.
Yeah,
whether he was related to the president or not.
Because they were from Virginia, right? So...
Yeah.
But George Adams was a very successful man. He owned a railroad. He owned milling operations. He owned boats for shipping cargo down the Mississippi River and the Ohio River. He owned a company that manufactured bridges.
So he was
Apparently,
into
there's a very famous
transportation.
bridge somewhere in Ohio that his company built.
So he was a transportation guy. He made his money in, moving people around the country, I guess, and in a sense, getting cargo shipped and moved and bridge building, all of those kinds of things. So one of those, what did they used to call them? Movers and shakers of the day, right? All these guys that were involved with the railroad expansions, all of this, they made big money fast. At that time.
Part of the industrialization of that particular area, and I imagine a pivotal part of Ohio.
So, Ian, tell us more about is his name Wells? Mr. Wells or Adams? George Adams. George Adams.
Now, the whole famous aspect of Prospect Place with George Adams is that he was also an abolitionist.
Okay.
And there was opportunity for him when he was taking his boats down to Louisiana to ship the flour that they had manufactured down there. When they were empty on their return trip home, they would gather runaway slaves, hide them in the lower decks of the boat, and bring them back to Ohio, where they could then go to the different Underground Railroad stations and off to Canada or wherever it was that they were heading off to.
Upstate New York.
Now, the man.
Yeah.
What's that, Rachel? Sorry.
Oh, I upstate New York.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
There's a lot of underground railroads up here in upstate New York.
Yes.
Now, Prospect Place, the mansion itself, was actually a station house on the Underground Railroad.
Wow.
And it's said that George Adams built the mansion in the style that he did, designed it with that in mind of making it a Underground Railroad station. So you've got the Widow's Walk watchtower up on top, and from up there you could see 360 degrees around the property. And in addition to Mr. Adams bringing in the enslaved people on his boat, the property was open to those who were on land coming across. And what they would do is they'd go up into this tower, and when it was safe for the enslaved people, runaways, to run towards the house, they would light a lantern up in this tower, and they would know that, okay, here's the signal, it's safe. And they were funneled down into these large basement doors. If you get the right photographs, you can see the doors in there. And these enslaved people would go down into the basement, into several rooms that were built down in the basement for that. And when they arrived, Mr. Adams gave them food and clothing and medicine and anything else that they would have needed at that time to help them out at the moment, as well as help them out through their continuing journey.
But what ghosts, Ian, do you know that reside here? Like, what did you hear or what have you read? I've picked up on a couple of them. So,
well, I want to go back to the Underground Railroad.
Oh yes, let's do
because
that.
It's believed that some of the runaway slaves that were sheltering in the mansion station house, it's possible that some of them died from their ordeal while they were there, and it's believed that they are possibly buried somewhere on the property. And there's reports of people who go in there, and if you get down there,
Mhm.
There's reports of people hearing footsteps, disembodied voices, seeing shadow figures, apparitions, physical touches. I know an account of a couple of women who claim they've actually been physically scratched.
Oh,
Interesting that you say that, because I read there was a really quite poignant story of one of the people that were fleeing for their life. And she had been wounded somewhere along the way, been hurt. They'd hit her in the head. Somebody had tried to hurt her. And when she arrived here at the house, she was amongst several that had come there at that time. And she wasn't well. They tried to help her. They tried to aid her as best as she could and as best they could to help her. And unfortunately, she passed away, and she's said to be there. And the one thing that I found interesting was that the people that have reported feeling her and sort of having interaction with her was that she's not angry and she's not malicious. She's actually quite lovely in terms of her spirit that's been left behind, and that she, I guess, and until I'm there and I can actually pick up on this, but the story says that she feels quite comfortable being there and that she's not unhappy. So there's something there. Did you come across the story, Ian, of the little girl?
I've heard the story. Yeah, the little girl, she fell, apparently, this is the same story. Mm-hmm. She fell from the second floor, that there was a little balcony at one time.
Yes, apparently right here.
Yes, that door right there. There used to be a balcony.
Oh, no, how sad.
Door went out onto, and she fell from it, but and was killed. Mm-hmm. But as I say, I've heard the story, but what I have not heard is exactly who this little girl is. So, I've never heard a word about it, so I've just kind of discounted for myself as a paranormal researcher. I've just discounted that story because there's nothing out there that says, why was this girl there? Who was she?
Actually, there is.
Oh, there is?
And the house has records. The museum themselves have it. So she was a child of one of the family members. She was about 6 to 8 years old, and she was ill. She had possibly, a fever. It could have been scarlet fever. It could have been strep. It could have been, and it was the winter time. And I guess she was a little bit disoriented, and she opened the door and she somehow slipped and fell over the railing. Because, when you're sort of in that fever state, you don't quite know reality from, fantasy at that point. And so they believe that she fell and she died. She has been picked up quite a few times from researchers, from what I hear. So really? Again, one of those stories that when I get there, I'll see if I can get a name. I can try to get more information, but it is listed in the history of the house. So I don't know that they'd actually list that if it wasn't something that they could verify.
When I do paranormal investigations, I like to go in blind. I don't know if you do as well, Seika.
I do, yes.
I don't like to know any of the history, nothing. I just go in and see what comes up and what I can pick up. That feels more genuine.
It does.
Yeah.
But sometimes we do know the stories, right? And again, we can either collaborate with those, or we get other stories. So I prefer to not know about things, but when I do know, I'm not going to shut it all down and go, oh, well, I'm not going to get anything, because I'm just open more to maybe expanding on those stories or finding out more if I'm able to get better communication, and can get more of a story. But there's that story as well. So what else did you come across, Ian?
Well, there's a popular paranormal story that it's actually an oral history that comes down through the family of George Adams. And it's about a bounty hunter that
I did hear this one.
Approached the property when the house was an underground railroad station. Yes. And this bounty hunter, he rode up to the building and banged on the door. And when George Adams answered the door, this bounty hunter said, "I know that you have slaves hiding in there. I demand that you turn them over to me so I can take them back and collect the bounty."
Oh my
So
goodness.
George Adams, being who he was, apparently he pulled out his revolver.
Mhm.
And
Oh,
George Adams and this bounty hunter had a standoff.
Yeah, yeah.
There at the
oh
front door.
wow,
Yeah.
that's so.
And
I love that.
yeah, and this standoff kept going until some of the ranch hands from the barn or the stable area
Mhm.
saw what was going on, and they grabbed their rifles
Yeah.
and
Probably
they
the
came out
Winchesters. Mhm.
to protect their
Yeah.
boss. And seeing that he was outnumbered, the bounty hunter took off and hightailed it out of there. Now, what I've heard, and this actually comes from an interview I saw of George J. Adams, who was the great grandson of George
Senior.
of the George Adams. And that story about the bounty hunter, that is actually documented. But now
I love that. I love that story. It's fantastic.
Yeah. So that's actually documented history. But now here comes the fun aspect of it, that there's a continuation of the story that, okay, is it real? Is it legend? No one knows. So what happened is when the bounty hunter took off, the ranch hands, they chased him back to where he was encamped, his campground, and they captured him. And they dragged him
Yes,
back.
I've heard this too. Yeah.
This is movie magic right here. This is a movie waiting to happen.
Yeah, so they captured him. They dragged him back to Prospect Place. They put him in the barn, and they strung him up in the rafters of the barn, and they hanged him. So again, there's this story that
they hung him.
And that his body is also buried somewhere on the property. And people say that, again, this contributes to the paranormal aspects of the property. Hauntings within the barn. Again, people claim to see shadow figures.
Wow.
Scratched. People have recorded EVPs. But again, that screams ghost story, right?
I love it. That's what this is about. That's what we're talking about.
They say that the bounty hunter coming up to the door and having the standoff with George Adams is documented. The rest of it?
No, I thought when I was on the website they were talking about George Adams's grave, and they said it was unmarked. Is that correct?
No, George Adams is, excuse me, George Adams is buried.
Is he buried on the property as well?
No. He is buried in the Dresden Cemetery.
Oh, right.
Yes,
Yeah, in Dresden, Ohio.
Oh, okay then.
Right. So,
Now,
so it's kind of interesting.
Now, there's one more thing that I have here that contributes to what could be why the property has paranormal hauntings. That in 1912, there was a very serious train accident that happened nearby the property. And there was a passenger train that had become disabled, and it was sitting there broken on the tracks. And what happened is a second passenger train came up at high speed behind it and smashed into the back of the first train. And so in addition to the injuries that would have happened from the collision, the second steam engine, when it hit the back of the first train, the steam engine exploded. And of course, those old locomotives, a lot of people were scalded very badly from the steam of this exploding locomotive. And I'm not familiar with the layout of the geography of that part of Ohio, but apparently what they needed to do was to get a third train to come in to remove the injured and the dead. And until they could clear up the accident, the injured were all moved into the basement of the mansion.
So it's a little bit like the whole thing in Dundas.
Yes.
With the holiday train and the bodies and the people moved into the school.
Yeah. So where they had sheltered the enslaved African Americans during the Underground Railroad, that same basement was used to shelter these injured train passengers until they could be transported to the hospital in Dresden. And that's another thing that says, well, that could have contributed to the paranormal aspects, because it's unknown actually if any of them actually died while they were in the basement of the building.
Thank you for watching The Ghost Show Online. Join your hosts again next week as they discuss more tales of the supernatural, the paranormal, and all things spectacular. See you soon.